The sun was dying beautifully over Redstone Flats, bleeding its last oranges and crimsons across the Arizona sky like something painted by a man who knew it was his final canvas. The dust on Main Street caught that light and held it, turning the entire town the color of warm copper. It was the kind of sunset that made even the roughest frontiermen pause mid-stride and look west for just a moment, quiet, almost reverent, before remembering they had somewhere to be. Nobody paused longer than necessary in Redstone Flats. That was simply the way of things. The stagecoach arrived at 5:30, rattling and groaning down the main road like it had personally survived something terrible, which, given the 300 miles of Arizona wilderness it had just crossed, it likely had. The horses pulling it were lathered and grateful to stop. The driver climbed down with the slow, deliberate movements of a man whose spine had not forgiven him yet. Then the door opened, and Jessica Calloway stepped out. She descended the coach steps with the kind of composure that takes years of careful training, back straight, chin-level, gloved hand resting lightly on the iron rail. Her traveling dress was deep green silk, immaculate despite the journey, which spoke either to extraordinary luck or extraordinary stubbornness. Her dark hair was pinned precisely beneath a hat that cost more than most Redstone Flats residents earned in 2 months. She was 27 years old and carried herself like someone who had never once been uncertain of where she stood in any room she entered. But her eyes, dark, quick, and sharply intelligent, moved across the town with something she would never have called uncertainty, though that is precisely what it was. Redstone Flats stared back at her without apology. 3 children on the general store porch stopped their game and openly gaped. A woman hanging washing on a line across the street shielded her eyes to look longer. The sheriff, a broad, sun-weathered man named Briggs, crossed from his office slowly, nodding at her with the careful respect reserved for people whose trouble he hadn't yet identified. "Miss Calloway," he said, "welcome to Redstone." "Thank you, Sheriff." Her voice was smooth and composed. "I'd like to reach Copper Hill before dark if possible." "I'll have someone take you directly." The Copper Hill Ranch sat at the eastern edge of town, her uncle's life's work, left to her in full upon his passing 3 months prior. She had never visited while he was living. That was a truth she carried with a particular kind of quiet guilt, which she managed by not examining it directly. What she knew of the ranch came through letters, her uncle's warm, rambling letters about red earth and wide skies and horses that seemed to understand things people didn't. What she found upon arrival was a property that had, without its master, begun the slow work of returning to wilderness. The foreman, a lean and weathered man named Dalt, met her at the gate and walked her through the hard facts without softening them. 2 of the 3 ranch hands had left. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture. The fence lines needed riding and repair work that had to be done on horseback routinely by someone who knew the land. "Can you ride, Miss Calloway?" Dalt asked, not unkindly. She met his question with a steady look. "I intend to learn." He nodded slowly, in the manner of a man cataloging future problems. "Yes, ma'am." That night a letter arrived from her father's lawyer, crisp and efficient as everything her father dispatched. The message was simple: manage the property yourself or accept the standing buyout offer from a Mr. Garrett Hale, Redstone Flats' most prosperous landowner. Her father, the letter implied with diplomatic delicacy, considered the latter considerably more sensible. Jessica folded the letter, set it on the desk, and did not sleep particularly well. She found the stable the following morning without asking for directions. She had always been good at finding things without asking, and stood at the paddock fence observing a chestnut mare with the expression of someone attempting to solve a problem through sheer force of intellectual will. The horse, a calm and patient animal named Ruby, observed her back with enormous dark eyes and absolutely no concern. Jessica entered the paddock. Ruby took 3 unhurried steps away. Jessica followed. Ruby moved again. This continued for several minutes with a kind of polite absurdity that Jessica found profoundly humiliating, though there was fortunately no audience. Or so she believed. She's reading you. She turned. A man leaned against the far fence post with the easy stillness of someone entirely comfortable in his own skin. He was perhaps 32, with kind, observant eyes and the sort of sun-lined face that suggested years spent outdoors without vanity or complaint. He wore a plain shirt, worn boots, and an unhurried expression. In one hand he held a worn leather satchel, the kind schoolteachers carry. "I beg your pardon," Jessica said, her composure returning instantly to full deployment. "Ruby," he said, nodding toward the mare. "She reads nerves. She's not scared of you, she's just waiting to see if you're scared of her." A pause. "Are you?" The question was entirely without condescension. That was the disarming part. "I don't know her well enough to be scared of her," Jessica replied carefully. Something moved briefly in his expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. He tipped his hat. "Elias Cole," he said. "I teach over at the schoolhouse." And then, without pressing further or offering anything she hadn't asked for, he simply walked on. That evening she found a folded note tucked beneath the stable door. The handwriting was clean and unhurried. "Sunset's the best time to learn. Horses are calmer then. The field behind the schoolhouse. Come if you like. No obligation." She read it twice. Then she smoothed it flat and set it beside her father's lawyer's letter on the desk, and found, somewhat against her will, that she knew precisely which one she intended to answer. She arrived at the field at 10 minutes past sunset, telling herself it was purely practical. Elias was already there. Ruby stood beside him, bridle-free, entirely unbothered by the fading light or the woman approaching across the dry grass with her silk sleeves and her careful posture and her dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He said only, "Start by breathing." She almost said something sharp. Instead, she breathed. Ruby turned her great head and looked at her, and this time did not move away. Jessica said nothing, but something behind her sternum shifted quietly, like a door she hadn't noticed swinging open on a windless evening, almost without sound. She told herself, riding back to Copper Hill in the dark with dust on her sleeves and her heart slightly unsteady, that it was simply gratitude. She was a precise and intelligent woman. She was also, on this particular matter, entirely wrong. She came back the next evening, and the one after that. By the end of the first week, it had become something neither of them formally acknowledged, a standing arrangement built entirely from habit and the particular silence of two people who understand, without discussing it, that something is worth protecting in its early stages. Jessica would arrive at the field behind the schoolhouse at sunset. Elias would already be there. Ruby would already be waiting. And the lesson would begin the way all meaningful things begin, slowly, without announcement, with great attention paid to the small details. The progress was real and honestly earned. Week 1. Mounting without assistance, sitting straight, learning that the saddle was a conversation rather than a throne. Week 2. Walking Ruby in wide circles, learning to communicate through her knees and hands rather than panic and grip. Week 3. Trotting, which Jessica initially described with characteristic precision as a form of organized suffering, until her body finally stopped fighting the rhythm and began, almost reluctantly, to move with it. Elias taught the way he did everything quietly, without theater. He corrected her without diminishing her. He praised her without exaggerating. When she made the same mistake 4 evenings in a row, he simply found 4 different ways to explain the same thing until one of them landed. She noticed this about him early and found it, privately, remarkable. She had been taught many things in her life by many qualified people. Not one of them had ever made her feel that the learning itself was something she deserved to take her time with. Between exercises, they talked. It began as practical conversation. The ranch, the land, Ruby's temperament in different weather. But the wide open evenings had a way of loosening things, and gradually the talk moved inward the way sunset conversations tend to. Jessica told him about her father's empire, the railroads, the endless dinner parties, the carefully arranged world in which her primary function was decorative, and her opinions were tolerated rather than sought. She told him about the society marriage she had fled, a match between herself and a perfectly respectable man she felt absolutely nothing for, engineered by two families who treated the arrangement like a merger. "And yet you came west," Elias said one evening, watching her walk Ruby in a slow arc. Not a question, more like someone reading a sentence aloud to make sure they understood it. "My uncle's letters always made it sound like a place where a person could simply be a person," she said. "I wanted to find out if that was true." "Is it?" She considered the dust on her boots, the reins in her bare hands. She'd stopped wearing gloves to the lessons 2 weeks in. "I'm beginning to think it might be." He smiled at that, turned away toward the fence and said nothing further. But she noticed he stood a little straighter the rest of that evening. He gave her pieces of himself too, offered carefully like items removed from a pocket, not all at once, but consistently over time. He'd grown up in Ohio, trained as a teacher, and followed a woman he loved to the frontier when she'd inherited land of her own, a detail that landed quietly between them without comment. She had not stayed. She found the West too unfinished, too raw. She returned east after 2 years, and Elias had remained not from inability to leave, but from a genuine and simple love for this place and its people. The children at the schoolhouse had become, in the way that essential things become essential, the thing he built his days around. "Don't you get lonely?" Jessica asked once, the question arriving before she'd fully decided to ask it. He thought about it honestly. "Some evenings," he said. "Less recently." Neither of them addressed that directly. The dust settled. Ruby snorted softly. The sky went from gold to violet, and they ran slightly late, which neither of them mentioned either. The town, meanwhile, had opinions. Redstone Flats was a community of good people who, like all communities of good people, found great interest in the private arrangements of its members. The schoolchildren were enchanted. Miss Jessica had begun appearing at the afternoon reading hour twice a week, sitting at the back of the room and quietly helping the slower readers sound out their words with a patience that surprised everyone, including herself. Their parents were largely warm toward her. But Clara Hatch watched the sunset field from her kitchen window with the careful attention of a woman cataloging something that concerned her deeply. And Garrett Hale, broad, prosperous, and accustomed to acquiring what he identified as valuable, watched Copper Hill Ranch with the patient interest of a man waiting for the right moment. That moment, he decided, had arrived. He began with buyout offers, each one slightly more aggressive than the last, delivered through intermediaries with a politeness that barely concealed its pressure. When those went unanswered, he shifted tactics. Words were placed carefully in the right conversations around town, that Miss Calloway's nightly visits to the schoolhouse field were rather unusual, that Elias Cole was perhaps not entirely a disinterested party, that the whole arrangement had a quality to it that respectable people might reasonably question. Elias heard the rumors on a Thursday. By Friday evening, his expression at the fence was different, still kind, but careful in a way it hadn't been before, as though he'd redrawn a boundary he hadn't previously felt the need to mark. He waited until Ruby was brushed and settled before he said it. "I think you're ready to ride on your own now." A pause. "The lessons have run their natural course." Jessica went very still. "Is that what you think, or what you've been told to think?" "My reputation here is something I've built over years." "And mine," she said, her voice clean and direct as a blade, "is something I've carried across 300 miles of wilderness specifically to build on my own terms. I did not come this far to let gossip instruct me on who I may spend my evenings with." He said nothing for a long moment. The field breathed around them. Then quietly, more quietly than anything he'd said to her before, "I'm not afraid of what they're saying, Jessica. I'm afraid of what I'm feeling. And I don't think a woman like you would ever truly choose a life like this. Choose," a pause, barely perceptible, "someone like me." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard a man say. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, because she did not yet have the words for what was moving through her, she left. 2 sunsets passed. The field behind the schoolhouse held only one silhouette, Elias at the fence, watching the sky burn through its colors alone. He stayed until the light was completely gone both evenings, which told anyone paying attention everything about the state of him. On the third evening he arrived at the field out of nothing but habit and stood in the cooling dark long after the sky had finished its performance, Ruby beside him, both of them patient in the way of creatures accustomed to waiting for things that matter. The field was quiet. Her absence, he discovered, was considerably louder than anything Redstone Flats had ever said about either of them. Jessica rode Copper Hill alone for 2 days. Every acre of it, the northern fence lines where the dry grass grew tall and gold, the rocky eastern ridge where the land dropped away into a copper-colored valley, the wide southern plain that caught the afternoon light and held it like something precious. She rode Ruby without hesitation now, reins easy in her hands, body moving with the horse rather than against it, and somewhere in the rhythm of those 2 days she understood that the riding itself was no longer the point. It had perhaps never been the point. She stopped on the eastern ridge the second afternoon and sat in the saddle looking out across the valley below, the red earth, the scrub brush, the distant outline of Redstone Flats shimmering in the heat, and she conducted, with the ruthless precision she applied to all important matters, a thorough accounting of herself. She had come west to escape a life that had been arranged around her without her consent. She had found, unexpectedly, a place that asked nothing of her except honesty and effort. She had learned to ride. She had learned to breathe first. She had learned, and this was the piece she had been slow to name, that a man's worth was not measured in what he owned or commanded, but in what he offered freely, without agenda, simply because it was in his nature to give it. Elias Cole had taught her to ride by never once making her feel that not knowing was a failure. He had talked with her, not at her, not around her, not about her, but genuinely with her, the way that people do when they regard you as someone worth the full weight of their attention. He had been honest about his fear, which required more courage than she had initially understood. And she had walked away from that honesty without answering it, which she now recognized as the single most cowardly thing she had ever done in a life she had otherwise conducted with considerable nerve. She turned Ruby toward town. She arrived back at Copper Hill to find 3 men she didn't recognize standing inside her fence line, one of them holding a document and speaking with Dalt in the clipped, official tones of someone performing authority rather than possessing it. Garrett Hale stood at the gate on his horse, composed, expensive, and watching her return with the expression of a man who had arranged the scene and was pleased with it. "Miss Calloway," he said, pleasantly, "these gentlemen represent the county land assessor's office. Given the property's operational difficulties, there are questions about the legitimacy of the current claim. A woman operating alone, without proper—" "Show me the documentation," Jessica said. He blinked. "I beg your—" "The legal documentation authorizing a county assessment of privately deeded land. Show it to me now, or remove these men from my property within the next 60 seconds. Hale's pleasant expression adjusted carefully. "Miss Calloway, I'm trying to help." "You are trying," she said, "to acquire something that does not belong to you. Those are different activities." The standoff held. The 3 men looked at Hale. Hale looked at Jessica. Jessica looked at no one in particular because she was reading the document being held, which she had already identified from the saddle, as a county form with the wrong heading for the action it was allegedly authorizing. Then she heard horses at the road. Elias arrived with 3 men she recognized from town: Frank Aldridge, whose eldest son read beautifully now; Tom Reins, whose daughter had recently conquered long division; and Will Cabot, who'd repaired the schoolhouse roof last autumn without being asked. Good men, steady men. Men who had decided, apparently, that this particular morning required their presence. Elias dismounted, walked to the fence, and addressed the county representatives with the quiet, thorough authority of someone who had spent the previous evening reading land law by lamplight until he understood it completely. "The deed for Copper Hill Ranch," he explained, producing the original document, correctly filed, precisely cited, transferred full and unconditional ownership to Jessica Ann Calloway upon the death of her uncle, Robert Calloway, with no operational clause, no gender contingency, and no provision for county review outside of formally filed legal dispute, which had not been filed. The assessment form being presented was the wrong instrument for the alleged purpose. The men holding it were, therefore, trespassing. Sheriff Briggs, who had followed the group at a thoughtful distance, confirmed this with a single nod. Garrett Hale withdrew. Not quickly, he was too composed for that, but completely, which was the part that mattered. The crowd that had gathered along the road dispersed in the slow, satisfied way of people who had witnessed something that would be retold accurately for years. Dalt went back to work. The three fathers tipped their hats to Jessica and rode back toward town. Sheriff Briggs paused long enough to say simply, "Good morning, Miss Calloway," and continued on his way. Elias stood by the Copper Hill fence, almost exactly the posture of their first lesson, she thought, the same stillness, the same unhurried patience. She walked to him. He began, "I wanted to make sure the deed." "Breathe, Elias," she said. He stopped. Then he laughed, soft and real and entirely unguarded, and she understood, hearing it fully for the first time, that she would like to spend a considerable portion of her remaining years being the reason for that sound. "I wrote you a letter," he said, and produced it from his chest pocket. Folded, slightly worn at the crease, in the same clean, unhurried handwriting as the first note he'd ever left her. She took it. Read it standing in the morning light while Ruby cropped dry grass nearby, and Elias watched the middle distance with the focused attention of a man pretending very hard not to watch her face. She finished, folded it along its original crease, placed it carefully in her pocket. "I'm not going back east," she said. "Not because I can't, because I don't want to. This is the first place I have ever felt entirely like myself." She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to look at things she wasn't afraid of anymore. "And I would like to keep coming to that field at sunset, not for lessons, simply to be there. A pause, clean and deliberate, with you." Elias was quiet for a moment in the way of a man receiving something he had convinced himself he would never be offered. "Every single night," he said. "Every single night," she said. 6 months later, Copper Hill Ranch was a thriving and well-regarded operation. Jessica had hired 2 capable hands, repaired every fence line on the eastern ridge personally, and established herself in Redstone Flats with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had chosen a place and meant it. She taught the girls at the schoolhouse to ride on Wednesday afternoons. She attended church on Sundays and had strong opinions about the hymn selection that the congregation found, after initial adjustment, entirely reasonable. Elias still taught by day, reading and arithmetic, and the long, patient work of opening young minds to what the world contained. His classroom had a new hand-painted map on the eastern wall, which his students had noticed was slightly more detailed in the Arizona Territory than anywhere else. And every single evening, without variation or exception, as Redstone Flats settled into its dusk, and the sky above the Arizona Territory performed its nightly extravagance of color, 2 horses appeared in the open field behind the schoolhouse. They rode side by side, unhurried, easy, moving together through the gold and the dust and the long, quiet beauty of a day well spent, and the town, watching from its porches and its windows and its doorways, found that the sight of them had become something it relied upon, something that made the evening feel complete, too, every single night.